All right. Well, welcome everyone to Ask Us Anything, which is our motto, and we're happy to get started today with this series on SCORM Cloud's API. So I'm Philip, the SCORM Cloud sales representative and moderator for this today's webinar. I've got Josh White and Nolan McDonald with me to talk about the API. I'll let them introduce themselves. Josh, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Josh White. I am the lead developer on the SCORM Cloud project. I've been working in this capacity for about 3 years, and I've been on the project for about 5 years in total. But I'm excited to answer some of your questions today. I'll kick it over to Nolan.
Hey, I'm Nolan. I'm a support engineer here on the cloud team. I've been at Russell C for a little more than a year and a half, coming up on 2 years. Yeah, just excited to be here with you guys.
All right, thanks guys. Well, first I want to say a big thank you to everyone who submitted questions ahead of time to be answered live. These webinars are all about you and the questions you have. So after reviewing your questions, we broke the webinar down into a few topics. We'll start with an overview and some more basic questions. The majority of attendees are aware, but don't know much before we dive into the more technical topics like postbacks. We are recording this webinar, and so we'll send out a link to view it once the recording is ready. And in that email, we'll also compile any of the helpful links and resources that we talk about today. So we had a lot of questions about the standards themselves. Our marketing team and Michael from the cloud team are helping us behind the scenes, and we'll chat out links throughout the webinar today, including links to our favorite standards resources, if that was your question. So let's get started, and a little bit about the SCORM Cloud API. So I'm imagining you already have or you're planning on building some type of front end which learners can navigate to, which allows them to sign up, to be authenticated, possibly pay for access to your content, and see some type of course library and curriculum. And then at the point where you would need them to actually play the content that's in some type of e-learning standard is where you can leverage our SCORM Cloud API. The SCORM Cloud API is a RESTful API that allows you to integrate our content player behind the scenes in 3 key areas: importing the content, playing the content, and tracking the content. And we support SCORM 1.2, SCORM 2004, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th editions, AICC, XAPI, CMI5, as well as MP3, MP4, and PDF content types, as well as LTI. So it's secure and allows you to customize your own front end while taking advantage of the tracking capabilities of all of these e-learning standards mentioned. So Nolan, do you want to share some benefits from the technical standpoint and how to get started using it?
Sure. So like Philip mentioned, SCORM Cloud has a RESTful API service that actually gives you a little more functionality than you have through our website. It allows you to automate menial tasks or fully integrate SCORM Cloud into your application as an e-learning content player. The API itself is defined by an open API specification that we maintain and make public. And that specification, which you can find on our client libraries page, is used to generate interactive documentation, as well as our 6 different client libraries using Swagger CodeGen. And if there's a language that we don't have a library for, you can use that open API spec to generate one yourself with Swagger CodeGen. Additionally, that spec allows you to import the API into tools like Postman to do some testing or to make one-off API requests that you don't necessarily want to build into your integration. Cloud's API service is hosted on AWS US East with CloudFront as its CDN, allowing you to launch e-learning content all around the world. And the services sit behind a load balancer that can scale up automatically as needed during periods of high usage. SCORM Cloud is built based on registrations, but as a free trial user, you have full access to the API. So if you build out an integration and you need to go back down to the free trial, you have all of your content and data will be safe and persist in SCORM Cloud, and your integration will keep working because the API is fully accessible to any tier. Getting started with the API starts with reading through our documentation, trying out API methods on our interactive API reference page, or using the spec, the API, open API spec to test things out in a tool like Postman, like I mentioned, as well as getting started with the client libraries, running the sample code that we include with those. That'll show you kind of the basics of importing courses, registering users, launching that content, and then pulling the data out of SCORM Cloud. And for anything else, ask us anything, and that's what we're here to do. So
Awesome. Thanks, Nolan.
Yeah.
All right, well, let's go ahead and get started. Here's some of the questions that folks sent in. How can users get the most out of the API and make it work for them? Is there a guide?
Yeah,
Absolutely.
we have a bunch of guides in our documentation, a couple very high level tutorials, as well as some of the more nitty gritty technical details.
Yep, and I think we just threw that in the chat. So great starting question. All right, how can an organization benefit from using SCORM Cloud's API?
I can take that one.
Yeah,
There are a number of ways. It really depends on what your business use case is. And looking at some of the tutorials on our documentation kind of start to outline some of the use cases that Cloud has to offer, one of which being if you have content which you need to register learners for and track their progress. It's a great way to have a centralized place where that content lives, launches from, and where you can get the results of learners taking those trainings. Also, if you are distributing content, we have mechanisms such as dispatch, which allow you to import your content in the cloud and then share that out to other departments of an organization or even other organizations while maintaining control of that content, being able to set license limits on how many people can register for it or even turn it off with a switch in your SCORM Cloud account. So those are a few of the things, but if you have specific use cases, I would reach out to one of us on the support team or dig through the documentation a little bit more to see what we have to offer.
Very good. All right. And here's another question. How can you leverage the SCORM Cloud API for testing and troubleshooting purposes?
So with the API specifically, there's a concept of previewing courses, launching into a kind of a preview mode to just check and see how it plays, how the course launches with the settings that you have set up. On our website, we also have the concept of sandbox launches, which is essentially the same thing, but you actually get a user interface where you can view the debug logs, and that's just a log of everything that the course is setting, completion and time spent, and how the learner is responding to questions in the e-learning content. Is there anything you would add to that, Josh?
Sure. I think another important tool that we have that's available through the API is when you import a course, you get import warnings, which can sometimes be helpful. SCORM Cloud is built over the years to be very forgiving with some common ways of malformed content. So some things that may play just fine on SCORM Cloud might not play in other LMSs, and the import warnings that we present are a clue that this might not work everywhere, even if it does work on cloud. Those are another important tool to know if your content may or may not work everywhere.
All right. And what are the options of authentication, content sharing, and reporting back?
So for authentication, the API methods support basic auth as well as OAuth with scoped access tokens. Content sharing, we might talk about dispatch, which Josh touched on a little bit. And reporting back, I guess we'll get into that too with postbacks and pulling data directly through the API a little bit later. Josh, did you have anything you want to add to those?
No, not in particular. Maybe to expand on content sharing, that could mean the dispatch thing where you're actually sharing your content out. Or if you're just talking about giving people training and tracking them and sharing the content in that regard, we have invitations as an option, registrations as an option. Yeah, a number of things that we could talk about.
Yeah, we've probably had some other talks about that, but the big key point there is you're doing it in a way that controls your intellectual property, which is huge. All right, where can I find information about app IDs?
I'll take that one. So that kind of depends on what exactly you're meaning. If you're asking about the concept of applications and what that means, that's available in our documentation. if you're asking about where you can find more information about a specific application from a technical aspect, you can look in our UI or even obtain data about applications from our API. And that includes information like how many registrations are in this tracked build period, what the storage size of the total courses is, some common metadata like that.
All right. And how can I track results and participation?
So, SCORM Cloud supports a number of different e-learning standards, and they all report progress and results and participation and things like how long the learner spends in the content. They all report a little differently. SCORM Cloud uses a registration model that tries to normalize all of them. So, tracking results is as simple as pulling down that registration. For SCORM content, it's generally looking at the big four, which is time spent, score, completion, and success status. Other standards like CMI5 or XAPI, there might also be XAPI statements that you might pull out of SCORM Cloud's XAPI compliant LRS, and those are a little more free form. The course can really say whatever it wants, and it allows you to track, things that are outside of the bounds of SCORM. There's a number of ways. We'll get into postbacks a little bit later, but just pulling that data through the API is one way, or tracking the reporting in the website as well.
I would throw in another thing with the participation thing, with the participation part of the question. One of the underused features in our UI and API is actually invitations and private invitations. These are kind of represent like a bundle of registrations that you would like to disperse to somewhere. This can be particularly useful if you want to like send training to a department and you have a couple of departments and you want to have them in bundles. So invitations have the notion of user invitations, which are the particular person that was invited to take the course. And each of these have a registration underlying them. But the user invitations API allows you to do some interesting things by getting like the big four from every person that took that. And that allows you to quickly like see who's done it and who hasn't, who's passed and who's failed. So you can look at that bundle of registrations in a way and get kind of an overview of each of the data points that you might need.
All right, thank you. And are API and XAPI the same thing?
Yeah, I'll take that one. So not exactly. Both are APIs in the sense they are application programming interfaces, which specify a data model and some interactions for communicating with that data model. XAPI is a e-learning specification which dictates all these things for us. Things like what the objects look like, what the API endpoints are, how you send and receive the data. It's a pre-designed system that we just implement by following the rules that are laid out in the specification. Our API is something that we designed and implemented. It includes the registration model that Nolan was talking about, which is our attempt to kind of unify what's important to you about your data, no matter what e-learning standard you're launching in. It is important to note that changes that happen to our API won't typically have any effect on our XAPI implementation. And even when we talk about the migration from V1 to V2, that is only with regards to our API, and XAPI is unaffected by this.
All right, awesome. Next question. I'm confused by the fact SCORM files can generate XAPI tin can reporting in SCORM Cloud. Is there something which shows what's possible for each learning module format?
I'll touch on that one a little bit. So there's a little bit of history behind this one. We were particularly early adopters of XAPI before anybody really knew what it was. So one of the ways that we tried to urge people to seek it out, find out what it was, see if it worked for them, was we had a tool built into SCORM Cloud called SCORM to Tin Can, where we would take SCORM registrations, and after they were done, we would convert them to generate XAPI statements and interactions off of the SCORM data. So this was a proprietary tool that we made basically just to create data within our LRS, basically to generate XAPI data, so that if you were launching SCORM content, you could also go over into your account and see, oh, what's this place that has all these interesting looking objects that can give me more information about these things. So that is sort of the history of how we converted SCORM format files to generate XAPI statements. One thing to know there is we have turned that off by default. It is now an opt-in setting. We had it running for a long time, and then XAPI adoption in the community caught up. So we generated way more data than we needed and that we intended to. So now it's off by default. If you want this functionality, it's still there. You just have to go and enable it for your account. As far as what's possible for the learning modules, Nolan, do you have some insight into that?
Well, I mean, besides this SCORM to tin can feature, I'm not sure if we have any other kind of one-off like features like that for any other learning.
What are the
standard or
what are the things that we actually translate to XAPI statements? Is it just the interactions in SCORM content? I know we have
so
like
we generate an attempted statement for just any launch, a completed statement for a completion. And then, like you said, for any SCORM interactions, we generate a statement for that interaction specifically. So it would have to have interactions built into the course.
All right. They're new to XAPI, so trying to understand the impacts from a billing perspective. Will all new learning records trigger a registration? So this is more applied to any standard, not just XAPI.
It's a little more complicated in the realm of XAPI. When we talk about XAPI, at its core, we're talking about that standard, which is an API, an LRS, and the data model and communication model. With the context of just API, like vanilla API, XAPI, we do not have the notion of a registration. So these are sort of the statements are anything you really would like them to be. They're not necessarily bound to the context of a registration. So the billing model for XAPI outside of the context of registrations is we have rate limits for how many reads and writes you can perform against our LRS based on what tier you're subscribed to. Now, there are other ways that XAPI are used that do conform to the registration model, and that is particularly with tin can packages or CMI5 packages, which are actual packages that are a different learning standard where XAPI is sort of the engine to make that data work. So both CMI5 and tin can, they do follow the registration model. So you have a package, you create a registration and launch it, and those are billed in the same way that you'd be familiar with the SCORM packages. But as far as just XAPI outside of the notion of a package, that is a rate limited service that we offer.
All right. Okay, so in reporting, why doesn't the date and timestamp always line up with when users actually complete a course?
So that, I have a hunch, might be time zone related. We store all things in cloud, and our database is UTC. So there are a number of things that could happen there. If someone was looking at a time that was displayed in our UI and they were expecting it to be their local time, that wouldn't be the case. It has also been the case that sometimes we've had bugs in places where we accidentally don't or do convert the time. So if there's a particular place you're seeing that you have an issue with, please reach out and let us know. But it could be just as simple as we convert times to the UTC when we're given anything.
All right.
Could that also be affected by like bad exits? Someone closing the browser instead of exiting the course, SCORM Cloud not knowing exactly when they exited?
It could be. Yeah, it really just depends on getting some more context from the question. But the date and time stamp line up with when the users actually completed a course. I would expect if that were the case, there would be the lack of the completed the course part of the question.
Yep.
All right. When new types of data, which new types of data will SCORM Cloud accept?
I think, Philip, you touched on that a little bit in the beginning, some that might be new to people in version 2 of our API, but we now accept media file imports, that's MP3s, MP4 video files, PDFs. We've also got support for reference links to YouTube videos. Those are all great new content types. And then also recently we finished implementation of LTI 1.3, which isn't necessarily a content type, but it's certainly a way where you can share your content in a different way that might be new to you.
All right. Does the V2 API JavaScript library need any database to show existing courses on a SCORM Cloud application, create registrations, launch the course, and see progress?
So I think the simple answer is no, it doesn't need a database, but to do all those things, well, to create registrations, you might want to keep a database to keep track of those registration IDs. All of these API methods require authentication, so you might, well, I guess database might not come in there. Josh, what would you say to this one?
So the short answer is no, you don't need one. The longer answer is we do not advise that you do such a thing.
That's what
there are some security concerns with where you're storing your keys, and while we've done a large step to mitigating that with OAuth tokens, in our V1 API, you were kind of bound by your app ID and secret key, and those are kind of the keys to the kingdom. Anybody that has those can look at all your other content in that application. They can do basically anything an administrator could do in your account. We've mitigated that a little bit with the introduction of OAuth tokens, which allow you to use those keys to generate a scoped token that has a short lifetime. And that's very suitable to passing to a browser for the browser to do things because it has a limited scope in what it can do. And also it has an expiry time that means it's just going to become invalid. So that is a really powerful authentication mechanism to pass to the browser, but you still need the piece somewhere that is actually using those important keys to reach out and create that token. So while you can do all this in the JavaScript library in the context of a browser, I would not necessarily recommend doing so because that could possibly leak out your keys.
All right. If the SCORM course is corrupt and the uploading fails, is there a validation API?
So there's not a specific, API service for content validation, but that is part of the upload and import process. So all of the jobs to import courses, well, all of the methods to import courses kick off a job, and either content is imported or it's fetched by reference from somewhere else. And then we put it through a couple of validation steps, things like checking the manifest file, scanning for viruses, just simple validation steps. And then you can query the status of that job with another method and see if there was something that went wrong in one of those validation steps. And we'll do a good job of trying to tell you, if there was something wrong with the manifest file or just informing you of what you need to fix with your content.
And perhaps some additional context there is that for the majority of our users, what are you going to do if you find out that the course is valid? Probably the next step is to, actually launch it and test it out. And so it's not really a common use case that we see for people to want to just validate and then ship something off somewhere, because typically that the validation of if the files are valid or not is followed up by testing it, launching it in a sandbox environment, seeing if the registration data rolls up properly. All the things that you would consider to be part of validation outside of just, will this import into an LMS?
All right. Any other tips for those with existing V1 API registrations as we convert those registrations to V2?
Yeah, I'll chime in here. So this is a question we've gotten asked fairly frequently, and I think it's important to cover the fact that the API version that you were using has no effect on the underlying registration data model. So there is no conversion process that happens on your existing data. The only thing that you can consider it, the only thing that changes is the format that we send it in. So if you call one of our V1 API methods to get registration data, you'll get it back in XML. If you call the equivalent method in V2, you'll get the exact same data back, just formatted in a different way. So as you're changing over your endpoints to change from V1 to V2, you're getting the same data. Postbacks are going to have the same data inside of them, just in different formats. It's important to remember that the data on the back end is the same. It's just how we're presenting it to you and the interface that we're trying to give you some more convenience in how you interact with that data.
All right.
If I can just add in too, in V1, setting configurations for things like postbacks only existed on registrations. So maybe something you can change about your V1 registrations that exist or your V2 registrations going forward is making use of our configuration hierarchy and setting things at a higher level where you can. So you can actually, we have a page in our docs about this, but you could set configurations like postbacks at the application level if you want them to apply to all of your registrations. And that way you don't have to go, if you ever need to update the endpoint or the credentials that we're using to send your system postbacks, you can do that with one API call rather than hundreds or thousands, depending on how many registrations you have. So just something to keep in mind going forward with V2 registrations, because something like that was not possible in V1.
Good to know. All right. Can the SCORM Cloud API be integrated with other LMSs?
Yes. That is effectively what the dispatch feature is that we you import your content into cloud, you dispatch it, which creates a proxy package, and then you give that proxy package to another LMS that thinks it's just a regular course. That LMS launches the proxy package, which reaches out to SCORM Cloud, and then a data pipe is opened, and whatever the learner does in that LMS is piped back to your back to your cloud account. So that's one way. There's any number of ways. I will say that we frequently get asked about, does SCORM Cloud integrate with X? Does SCORM Cloud integrate with Y? Commonly, the answer is no. We don't do a lot of custom work for custom tools because there are so many of them that so many people want. While we don't have built-in plugins or direct integrations with some tools, the API can probably be integrated with whatever you want it to, but it's ultimately your responsibility to create the glue that translates what you would receive from SCORM Cloud and push it into your system, which typically isn't that hard. If you feel like you want to do something like that, feel free to reach out to us and we'll help guide you through the steps in doing so. But as far as pre-built integration things, we don't have many of those.
Yeah, this question comes up quite a bit. So I like to tell folks, if you're wanting to export content out of SCORM Cloud while maintaining control of your intellectual property, any LMS that supports the basics of SCORM 1.2 can play a SCORM Cloud dispatch package that will redirect them to SCORM Cloud to play and track your content, and you're in control of it. All right, can I possibly see and track answers from essays and text entries?
Yes, if the course is set up to track that and record that as a, text entry from the learner as an interaction, often with SCORM Cloud or with the SCORM standard. And then with the API, you just need to make sure that when you're pulling down that registration, there's a couple of optional detail flags, things like turning on activities and interactions. So to see those kinds of things, like the actual text that a learner entered, you just want to make sure you have the full detail on.
All right. How customizable is the SCORM Cloud API?
It's a good question, and I think Nolan touched on this a little bit. That's one of the biggest features in our V2 API is the cascading configuration system. Those of you that are familiar with V1 might have had a pattern in your integration where with every registration you created, you set postback information there. And I think in V1, that was the only place we had it to set. So you wound up creating thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands of duplicate sets of information for every registration being sent to the same URL. But the configuration system in the V2 API allows you to set things that are common at a higher level, such as at the course level or application level, and have those cascade down to everything. So not only did we address postbacks with this, but all hosts of, there are lots and lots of settings that take advantage of this cascading system now. All of the player configuration settings that you see on the course details page, where you can important things like your launch type, if it's a frame set or embedded in your page, you can set all those at a higher level now, and you don't have to set them directly at the course or directly on a registration. and that's a really powerful thing that you can do. So I would say that the SCORM Cloud API is far more configurable in V2 than it was in V1.
All right.
Another thing that's great is when you go ahead and pull those settings too, it'll tell you, this setting is set at the course, or this setting is being pulled from the application, or maybe it just says default and it's not getting set anywhere. So it really gives you some good visibility into how the hierarchy is set up.
All right, all good news. Okay, moving on to postbacks, everyone. What are postbacks and how can you effectively leverage using them?
So postbacks, you may have heard them called webhooks. It's basically just a way that we can push registration progress data to an external system that you control or have. So this is really great. So you don't have to continually poll for just seeing what the progress is. You can just set a postback URL at one of the configuration levels, and then when we detect that some data has changed, we will push that out to whatever system you've configured using the authentication style and parameters that you've configured. So as far as an effective implementation of this goes, there's always the fact that we're working over the internet and web systems aren't always 100% reliable. So with postbacks, you should have a trust but verify relationship, as with most things. While we do have a robust retry system that has some exponential backoff, or if your system is failing, we do retry multiple times with backoff over 16 hours, I think. So that gives your system a little bit of time to recover and accept the postback. It could just be the fact that something doesn't make it to your system. So a robust integration would probably be something where you have whatever logic that you have handling the postback that we send you should be able to accept the web request, but also just the JSON object that you would pass into it with your code. Because this is because we very intentionally made it such that the payload that we send with every postback request is the exact same payload that you'll get if you call get registration progress from our API. So what we're pushing to you there is the same as you can pull for yourself. So if you tool your postback handler for you to be able to either accept a web request directly or accept the JSON that you just pulled for it, you can sort of correct any discrepancies along the way. Now, I typically recommend people track the last launch times, the end timestamp. So for every learner that launched, track the end timestamp, and then track also the last update received from us. And then at regular intervals, you can periodically check for any registration is the launch and timestamp before the last update that you received, or rather after the last update you receive, because that indicates maybe you didn't get the last post back. And this can commonly be a problem, and I think we'll touch on this later. This can commonly be a problem when people, when learners take training and then just close the browser when they're done. For a lot of content, this can kind of be seen as just like hanging up on the call rather than saying goodbye. So when browsers just get closed, it kind of hangs up and doesn't allow us to get the last payload, which might have the completion and all that stuff. So if we never get that, we'll never send it to you. And having a setup, like I said, where you're tracking the launch ends and the last received dates, you'll be able to detect that you didn't get that last thing. And then you can have something reach out to us, call get registration progress, pass that into your postback handler, and then you're all caught up.
All right. Now, how often do you send postbacks?
So we send a postback almost every time that there's data saved and rolled up to that registration record. The commit frequency is configurable. I think it defaults to 10 seconds. You can correct me if I'm wrong about that, Josh.
Yeah, so effectively, anytime we detect one of the big four changing, the big four being the score, the total time tracked, the success, and the completion. Anytime one of those change, we will send out a postback. That has the effect of if your course is registering total time tracked, then we will send it pretty much every time because we're getting an update to one of the big four every time. As Nolan said, at what interval that data rolls up in your course is configurable. It is not always advised to move that out to get fewer postbacks because then the longer you space things out, you increase the ability for you to lose data along the way. So while we'll be recording it in cloud, it may not make it to your system if that interval is so long, because that also allows somebody to close the course. And maybe the last postback you got was 20 seconds before them closing rather than in 10 seconds before them closing. And if at 10 seconds, you might actually get the completion.
All right. What events does SCORM Cloud send progress data to the postback URL?
Right. So like I mentioned, like this happens every time we roll up the data and there's a change to one of those big four. And then it also happens when the course goes through that exit process. So we send one final exit postback, which, like Josh mentioned, if the learner closes the browser, closes the tab, and doesn't effectively hang up the call, you might miss that exit postback. So it's important to be able to pull that data from the API when you need to sync things up.
All right. And when setting or changing a registration's postback URL, will the next postback immediately reflect, or is there a delay?
This is something that will happen immediately. And this is particularly, I mentioned our retry mechanisms with postbacks before. Typically, you'll get into this when you make some configuration change to your system and forgot that you're receiving postbacks or didn't take into consideration that that might be broken. So any changes that you make to configuration on postbacks on our end will take effect immediately, even if something is in the retry loop. So if there are registrations backed up in this retry loop because of a configuration change you pushed out to your system, you realize this, you come to our system, update the postback URL to point to the right place, or update the auth type or the username and password or whatever might have changed that broke things. All of the retries that are backed up will begin to use that new data and hopefully succeed at that point.
All right. Now, I think we might have already answered this, but I'm going to mention it. The SCORM training I uploaded into the cloud was completed by the trainee, but in the cloud, the status is incomplete. What can be the reason for that, and how can I fix it? Now, you mentioned a couple things. Either they closed the window early. Anything else you'd add to that one?
Yeah, this is the internet communication problem. Most of the time, this is the result of a learner closing the browser rather than pressing the exit button on a course. The ways that I would recommend combating this, because it is a possibility, it always will be a possibility that somebody's internet can go out or they close the browser or whatever might happen. The ways to leverage postbacks that I mentioned earlier are a way that you can detect this and fix that up. So keeping the tracking the launch end timestamp, the last date that you received an update from us, and then having something that checks every now and then to see if anything that you expect to have an update for you don't, and then you can go ahead and pull that from us yourself.
All right.
Yeah, and I would just add, sometimes the easiest way to fix this is to just relaunch and make sure that you get a clean exit. If the course doesn't have an exit button, the SCORM Cloud content player, we can add one to the top. So if you have courses or content from other vendors that don't have an exit button built in, our player can go ahead and add one, make sure your learners are exiting properly if you see this as a trend. Yeah, that's it.
All right. Is there a request limit for updating postback URLs via the API?
No. So there's actually no rate limiting on any of the API methods, unless we start talking about XAPI and the LRS. And then we do have some rate limits based on your payment tier. But you won't get rate limited. Yep.
I would chime in to say that this shouldn't be a problem for you because of the new configuration system. It is no longer the case that if you update something in your system, you have to crawl through every registration that you ever made and make sure that the data is updated. This problem should go away if you're setting the postback URL at the appropriate level, whether that be the course application or whatever, such that you should only have to change it in the place that matters rather than crawling through lots of records.
All right. What's your recommendation for folks who create custom reports for SCORM Cloud data in their custom apps?
Keep your data. Your data is your data. We recommended in our documentation and our integration guide. We are not necessarily a storage mechanism. While a lot of people treat us as such, we are the engine that takes a user interacting with course content and turns it into the registration data model. The registration data model is a big thing that has a lot of things that most people aren't interested in. So what I would suggest to you is decide what data you're interested in. When somebody launches a registration, get the registration data from us, store it in your database in whatever custom format you want. And then that's done with us. You don't have to ask for that registration data again, because it's not very common for people to retake training over and over again. Just decide what you want to do with the data up front, model it in your own system the way that you want it to, and then map what we give you to that model, and then you can do whatever you want.
All right, moving on to a more technical piece. How do I retrieve the LRS data from API, and is the data structure compatible to that from, say, the one from SCORM Cloud if the structure is not identical?
So the structure is not going to be identical because data in the LRS is going to be stored as XAPI statements. And so Cloud has a built-in XAPI compliant LRS. So for details on how you would pull those statements out or how you can manually put statements in, I would refer to the XAPI specification. Do you have anything you'd add, Josh?
No, I think we touched on it a little bit earlier. The XAPI data model is bound to the specification. The SCORM Cloud's API data model is something we've made. So those will always not always match up with each other. In fact, they'll never match up. And that's why. So as far as our SCORM Cloud API, the data model will always be identical for every learning standard that gets imported and interacted with through that API. If you're using XAPI, that's different.
All right, well, we're coming up to 45 minutes into the session today. We've received a lot of great questions so far. Josh, Nolan, and I will stay on till the top of the hour and keep answering your questions. But if you need to drop, we're going to send a recording of this entire session, just to let everybody know. So we'll continue with the questions, but we want to be conscious of everyone's time if you do have something you need to get to. All right, I guess we could jump to some of the other questions we have here. How can I see XAPI statements?
Yeah, so this is now.
Sorry.
So this is a question we get asked every now and then. One of the easiest ways is just you can see them through the website on the LRS viewer tab. This is a good way to verify what might be in your account. Interacting with them through the API, the instructions for doing so are effectively the XAPI standard. One of the things that's also important is we get tickets sometimes where people don't specify the correct XAPI version header. So when you're interacting with the LRS, you can only get statements that were set with the same version of XAPI that they were set with. So if you're setting statements with XAPI version 1.0.1 or whatever, and then you query for statements with the default version, which may or may not match, then you will see nothing come back. So it's important to know how you're setting the data and how you're asking to get it back, because sometimes we get a lot of tickets about people expecting LRS data to be there and they're querying for it and it's not there and they have their version header set wrong.
Okay. And how to tell if the IMS manifest .xml file is at the root of a SCORM package?
So I believe this is something that the import process, that those validation steps that we talked about earlier, will actually tell you if it can't find the manifest file or if it's in the wrong place.
Okay.
I'm not sure if we have anything else that would tell you, but if you try to import it, I'm sure.
We have also an API that lists all the files in a package. So you could easily do that as well, and then look through the output of the files within a package to make sure that the manifest is at the root.
All right, good to know. Is there any way to lock the .scorm file before I upload it in order to keep the rights for it to people who access through my admin account?
So the short answer is no. I think this is more of a UI question than an API question, but anyone that is an administrator of your account has access to do most things to your content. Now, if you want to have an API integration and make your own front end in front of it, you can leverage the OAuth scopes that we spoke about earlier to have more fine-grained access control and actually make your own roles for whatever your business model means. So you can have a role that you predefine as being able to read registration data, read course data, but not write or delete any of it. So you can kind of assemble these scopes into a permissions model that makes sense for you, and then use that in your own front end to interact with our API.
All right. Well, we've got some questions that came in from some folks on the call. So from Adam, we're using Articulate 360 and want to know if we can use your SCORM software in order to deliver, track, participation, completion of our developed courses.
So yes, that's basically what we do. A ton of Articulate stuff gets imported into Cloud, and it is Cloud is meant to deliver and track the participants' completion of it. Yes.
Yeah, and they've touched on a couple of the other ways you can do that, not just through the API, but through invitations. If the learner doesn't have access to an LMS, or if they do live in another LMS, you could use our SCORM Cloud Dispatch feature. Another question from Adam. Once our subscription is over, can we have access to all the stats with the free account? And can it be easily transferred into another platform such as Brightspace? So the first part I can answer, you can upgrade or downgrade at any time. You own your data. So even if you've been on a paid plan and you drop down to a free trial, all your content and registrations will be preserved. And learners can continue to resume or relaunch those registrations and that content. Josh or Nolan want to talk about how could they transfer any of that to another platform such as Brightspace?
As of now, yes, you can. So the stipulations of being on a trial account is you cannot have more than 10 registrations. So what that means is that if you have 1 million and downgrade, you cannot create another one. So you're locked from creating any more registrations. Another stipulation of a trial account is we have a storage limit for course content, which is relatively low. I think it's 100 megabytes. So if you have course content in your account, you can still launch existing registrations. You can still interact with the existing courses, but importing new courses or importing new registrations is blocked. As far as what you can get out, as of today, that is all perfectly possible to pull that data out, with the caveat that if you are expecting to pull XAPI data from us, the rate limits do apply, and they're quite low for trial accounts.
Yeah. All right. From Robert, good. Where can I find the swagger.json for your Open V2 API specification?
I think I saw that posted in the chat already. We can certainly
Michael might have already.
Michael can do that again, and we can make sure it's sent out in the email as well.
Okay. And what are from Jennifer Shackle, where are the size, or what are the size limits for MP4s? Do we have? I don't think there is one, is there?
I don't believe there is any size limits. I mean, there
aren't.
Just the size limit on the trial account for your total course library, which is 100 megabytes. But
correct.
If you're on any paid plan, there's no size limits for any piece of content or your entire library.
Yeah, and I'll also note that if you go to a paid plan and you upload your content, which could be any size, and you pay for that period, and then you downgrade to a free trial, that content that was previously uploaded will not be limited by the free trial. If you downgrade to the free trial, it'll be preserved. But like Josh mentioned, you can't upload new content or create new registrations once you've gone from a paid plan down to a free trial. You need to go back to a paid plan. So there's a lot of flexibility there. Okay, from Brett, all right. Is it possible to know your SCORM Cloud registration ID in the browser JS engine during a launch or the XAPI registration ID?
Yes. There is part of the launch mechanism in the V2 API is we allow for an additional values. It is a array of key value pairs that you can pass to your content. So effectively, during the launch, you could pass in the registration ID as one of these additional values, and then that will, I believe, be appended to the query parameters of the link. So you can pass in anything there. It can be your API registration ID. It can be your XAPI registration ID. It can be some additional metadata that you have about the learner that we don't have in our system. And we will just pass that through to the query parameter. Your content can consume it at that point.
All right, another one from Brett. In V1 registration, last accessed at didn't seem to update until the launch exited. Is the updated date in V2 similar, or will it continually update while the course plays?
For registrations, the updated date should represent any time we make a change to that data in our database. So the updated date should basically be reflected every time we send a post back or do roll up. It should be updated as the data is changing.
All right, and from Joe, can individual quiz answers be retrieved from a dispatched course? So SCORM Cloud is gonna capture those responses if they're passed as interactions.
Yep.
But when you're using SCORM Cloud Dispatch, Cloud's not going to pass the interactions to the LMS, but they will be recorded in SCORM Cloud.
Yep, exactly.
SCORM Cloud Dispatch will pass the big four: time, duration, completion status, pass, fail, and score by default. Okay, from Christopher, I don't know if my question was covered already, but are there any plans to add or expand ways to utilize the SCORM API for getting reporting data on SCORM dispatch completion, usage, etc.? Or do you guys think all bases are covered well enough there already?
So it perhaps could be something that we do to highlight better, perhaps in our documentation, how you can go about getting the dispatch completion. But one of the things we added in the V2 API that makes it easy to target what data you're pulling are all the optional filters on the GET requests for lists of things like registrations. This allows you to match on things like the ID. And I think for dispatches, we append like the destination ID to the registration. So you can craft a kind of a clever query to look at only the registrations that were created within a destination, or only the registrations that were attached to this course. So it is something that we might consider adding an easier way to do that, but everything is possible right now. You just have to maybe perhaps be a little more clever than you would need to be if we had a specific mechanism for that.
All right. Let's see if we have any more coming in. Keep them coming, everybody. Nolan, do you have anything you'd add to just best practices? I know a lot of times you offer our client libraries. I'm trying to think what else we have for best practices.
I mean, best practices or
It's kind of vague, isn't
it? Yeah, I mean, it depends on what you're trying to do, right?
I could chime in with a few. Keep your own data. One of the patterns that we see that's kind of frustrating to us is that we see people asking every single day for all of their registrations as sort of a sync job, when 95% of those are settled registrations where the data hasn't changed since that registration was completed, but yet we're returning it every single night. We've seen things where we're making 5 million requests an hour to somebody that's just trying to keep in sync. So when you create a registration, once it's done, get your data, keep it in the way that you want, and then forget it exists in cloud. That's a good way to minimize the communication between us and make sure that our system stays healthy for your launches, which are the most important thing, is that we can launch your content and track the results from that. As far as what data you can get from us, decide what's important to you, get it, keep it in your own way, and then forget about the cloud version of it. And that, in addition to utilizing postbacks, which is also helpful. That's a great best practice. Yeah, those kinds of things are what I would say.
Yeah, I would also add, if you're pulling your registrations with a method called get registrations, it's going to give you 10 at a time, and it's a paginated request, so you have to keep making it over and over. And a lot of people, wish we could return 100 registrations at a time, and we probably could for most people. But I think the small pages, and it is something that might change in the future, but I think the small pages kind of force people to follow more of the philosophy Josh is talking about keeping your data, because it can take a long time to enumerate all of the registrations if you have thousands. So what I often recommend to people is if you run like a weekly or monthly job, I mean, use postbacks to get updates as they happen. But if you want to do a sync job, run a job weekly or monthly that just pulls registrations that are updated within that last week. So the new get registrations in V2 has some filtering options. So you can filter by just the registrations that were updated, and that is going to include registrations that were created, because that update and create date are going to be the same when it's first created. And just run that weekly, and that will keep you from having to run these, hours, or making API requests for hours trying to just pull down all of your data when you're not even sure, what you already have stored and what's new. It can save you a lot of time and headache.
All right, looks like this will probably be the last question. From Christopher, the point on keep your data, does that mean we should assume at some point our data will or may be lost on the SCORM Cloud side? Meaning long-term, we should aim to have 100% of our SCORM data housed somewhere on our end. And then the follow-up question, the final reminder about the V1 deadline.
Yeah, I can touch on Christopher's question. It does not mean that you should assume that your data will ever go away in cloud. It will always, we will always be able to return it. We have had some conversations about perhaps making it a slower return of old data, which for all intents and purposes, you shouldn't really need anymore, like a registration from 7 years ago. We might make that an asynchronous, like, well, we got to go get it from the warehouse and return it to you kind of thing. But your data will never go away. The point that I really just wanted to make was the most important function of our platform for most, if not all of you, is launching that content and tracking the learner progress. That becomes harder when the system is fielding millions and millions of requests an hour from people that are just getting stale registration data. So that is not to say you should keep your data because we're going to get rid of it. You should keep your data because you know how you want it to look. It doesn't change after it's settled, and we have more important things to be doing than returning the same information over and over and over and over.
All right, and got another question from Praveen. We had faced cross-domain issue when the courses were loaded through dispatch files in Learning app. Did SCORM Cloud fix it?
So there was a cross-domain issue through dispatch files and Learning app. That we haven't done anything in this regard. This could have been an LMS configuration on the other side. I'm not sure. I don't think we made any changes towards this, but it is a problem that people run into from time to time, and I think it's handled in support. I don't know if Nolan has any more context there.
I don't.
We probably need some more context. Yeah,
it's kind of a case. Yeah.
All right, guys, this is an important one. What is the final reminder for the V1 deadline for SCORM Cloud?
Yep. So the V1 API is going away. We're deprecating usage of it. The day that we're going to flip the switch is targeted for January 31st. You should have been getting a number of communications leading up to now. We've seen a steep drop off in the people that are using it. So thank you for those of you that are making the migration efforts. But yeah, a reminder that at the end of January, V1 is going to be sunsetted. So do your migration things, reach out to us with any questions, comments, concerns, and we'll help you in any way that we can.
Yeah, and after today's talk, it sounds like there's some really cool things about the V2 API that folks would probably want to take advantage of. So, all right, well, that wraps up our webinar. Thank you so much, everybody, for asking questions. We got to take the full hour. That feels awesome. And we're going to be sharing this recording along with all the resources that Michael and Tara and Alicia have been throwing in the chat. So thank you again. Thank you for showing up and listening. And we look forward to next year. And we appreciate your business and happy holidays.